My topic for the talk tonight is a Buddhist perspective on relationships, and this is a topic I've talked about in the past, some years ago, but we've been doing a series, as you may know, on sort of practical applications of the Dharma, and this one seemed right in line with that. And as you know from my teaching, I often try to offer some practical ideas about how to bring the Dharma into daily life, and relationships certainly qualify, it seems to me, for that in terms of that which we struggle, with which we struggle. So suffice it to say, relationships are central to our experience as human beings. I mean, they are everywhere. They're central to us as social creatures. They're important for survival, for community, connection, intimacy, procreation, cooperation, safety, the list goes on and on. It's really probably the single driving force for us as human beings is our capacity for relatedness. And it's really why we survive as a species. I mean, evolution helped select for those that were good at relationships so that we could cooperate and fend off threats and cooperate to build institutions and so forth. And when I talk about relationships, I'm really talking about the whole spectrum. Partners, parents, children, sibs, co-workers, friends, acquaintances, right down the line, just you name it, anybody with whom we come in contact with. And with any of those, there will be varying degrees of intimacy. So some will be more, but the ones where we really tend to get tripped up tend to be the ones that are our most intimate relationships. Those tend to be the ones that are the most, for most of us, are the most problematic. We get conflicted there, we get challenged, we get humbled, we get hurt, we get elated, we get disappointed, and that can happen with anybody, but it particularly seems to happen within our intimate relationships. And I can say that in all my years practicing as a psychologist, that it was probably the single greatest source of suffering was that people would bring into treatment was issues with relationships. Just ask what brings you in, and invariably it was something to do with some aspect of their relationships. But on the upside, it's also where we experience joy, exhilaration, closeness, safety, comfort, protection, all the good stuff too. So I don't want to create the impression that it's only the problematic stuff, although that's what I'm going to primarily focus on tonight. And there's just tons of, the Buddha talked about relationships at length, with ourselves, with others, and I'll share a quote with you about that in a moment. But there's tons of research that's gone on in modern psychology on relationships. Sort of a couple of the more influential ones is attachment theory, which has to do with how our early bonding informs who we are. I won't get into that, except some of you may be familiar with attachment theory. It's had a profound impact on the field of psychology, of human psychology. And then, in particular with regard to relationships, is John Gottman's work, John Gottman and his wife, and what they call the four horsemen of relationships. And they've come up with these four qualities of relationship and have been able to predict with a high degree of accuracy the failure rate of relationships based upon the presence of some or all of these qualities. And they are criticism. If there's a high level of criticism in the relationship, that can be fairly toxic. Defensiveness on the part of either or both partners, contempt for the partner, and stonewalling, which is their way of talking about withdrawing into silence. And when any and all of those are present and aren't addressed, the likelihood of problems in the relationship is quite high and often will predict the demise of the relationship. This is from Bhikkhu Bodhi, the Buddhist scholar and monk and the translator of most of the Pali Canon. He says, the teachings of the Buddha while framed around the goal of individual deliverance from suffering, are also expounded for the purpose of instructing us in how to live in harmony with others. Such harmony is desirable not only as a source of satisfaction in itself, but also because it is a prerequisite for treading the path to higher freedom. The final peace of enlightenment can arise only in a mind that is at peace with others. Say that again. The final peace of enlightenment can arise only in a mind that is at peace with others. And the mind can only be at peace with others when we are actively committed to a course of training that enables us to extricate the roots of conflict that lie buried deep within our hearts. Once in ancient India, Sakka, the ruler of the gods, came to the Buddha and asked, "Master, by what bonds are people bound whereby, though they wish to live in peace, without hate and hostility, they yet live in conflict with hate and hostility?" The master replied, "It is the bonds of envy and avarice that so bind people that though they wish to live in peace, they live in conflict with hate and hostility." Bhikkhu Bodhi goes on to say, "If we trace external conflicts back to their source, we will find that they originate not in wealth, position, or possessions, but in the mind itself. They spring up because we envy others for the qualities they possess which we desire for ourselves, and because we are driven by an unquenchable avarice to extend the boundaries of what we can label as mine." End quote. You may recall the Buddha taught about the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. Again, all of those find our way into our relationships. So I want to talk about 4 relationship challenges that I think come from the Dharma that can shed some light on how we can incorporate the Dharma into our relationships and into our lives in terms of interacting with others. And these aren't discrete or separate, they're really interwoven and overlapping. But I'm going to speak about them separately, but think about them as overlapping and interwoven. The first one is the big E, the ego, the belief in a separate I or me. And the ego in some ways is antithetical to the cooperation required in a relationship because it's about me, my needs, my wants, what I need. And in order to succeed in relationships, we have to be able to set that aside to some extent. You know, if my relationship is dominated by my ego needs, it's going to be pretty lopsided and pretty problematic without some attempt to address that, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And keep in mind that this notion of a separate self or separate of the ego is the Buddha taught, a primary source of suffering. So what are some of these qualities that are born of our ego? Well, competition, winning, self-importance, or narcissism, moral superiority and privilege, selfishness, entitlement, the list goes on and on. All these qualities of the ego, which can dramatically interfere in terms of the quality of our relationships. I mean, any of these can be toxic and tend to be antithetical to things like compassion, empathy, the positive qualities that relationships thrive with and that we can bring to a relationship to counter the ego. Those of you that were here last week, Bob Hodge spoke about the 8 worldly winds, and again, they find their way in and again have to do with the ego and satisfying the needs of the ego. Praise and blame, gain and loss, fame and disgrace, and pleasure and pain. And I'm not going to delve into those deeply tonight, except to say that, you know, those are all sort of ego-driven worldly winds that the Buddha taught. And we're battered by these winds daily, and they find their way into our relationships. They find our way often in the form of our ego. So working on this is fertile ground in terms of trying to bring the Dharma in and addressing the ego, and we'll talk about some specifics in a few minutes. fertile ground on which to grow our relationships, if we can address that constant pull, that constant tug of the ego to be satisfied. So that's number one of the four, the number one challenge of the four relationship challenges. Number two is the absence of mindful presence. In other words, not showing up for the other person, not listening, not trying to understand, not walking in the other person's shoes. So by not bringing mindful presence to our relationships, can do damage. So if we're judging, criticizing, dismissing, mocking, not understanding, not giving undivided attention, all of those suggest an absence of mindful presence. If we bring mindful presence, then it's an antidote to some of those qualities, those again more selfish qualities such as judging, criticizing, dismissing, mocking, and so forth. And perhaps most importantly is in this issue is not remaining present for the difficulties and challenges that arise. Sort of if difficulties and challenges arise, checking out, as opposed to bringing mindful presence to whatever difficulties come up. And they will come up. We all know that. Every relationship presents us with challenges. If we withdraw, if we push away, if we don't show up for the difficulties, it's going to be really hard to maintain that connection. So it's really wanting to love other people, love those that we care about without holding back, bringing an authenticity to them in terms of mindful presence. Someone said, each day we listen to inner voices that keep our life small. And instead of responding to those voices, it's again showing up. Just showing up for others. And it's hard, it's challenging. I mean, it's difficult to show up. It asks a lot of us to do that. So that's number two, the absence of mindful presence. Number three is what I call relational grasping and clinging. We know the Buddha taught and the Four Noble Truths teach that the source of suffering is grasping and clinging. But what happens when grasping and clinging takes the form of relational grasping and clinging? In other words, the wish or belief that others should be or act as we want them to, and clinging to that, expecting that, being disappointed when that doesn't happen. This, again, can be very toxic to our relationships. And a lot of times we have in our relationships, if we really bring discernment to them, a fixed expectation for others. This is how I expect you to be. And a lot of times it's not conscious. I'm not consciously aware of what my fixed expectations are for you. But nonetheless, there they are. So for instance, with a partner, why isn't he or she more supportive? Why isn't he and she more interested in what I'm interested in? Why isn't he or she this way or that way? With a child, why don't they do what I tell them? Why don't they behave the way I think they should? Grasping to those notions that someone should be other than who they are. I can tell you this has been a huge issue in my own marriage, and it's something I've really worked hard on, but this notion of how the other person, how my wife, how I expect her to be, how I want her to be. And we suffer. We put tremendous strain on the relationship when we bring grasping and clinging to how we want the other person to behave, how we expect them to be with us, toward us. And then the fourth, which in some ways is really born of the prior three things that I've talked about, the ego, the relational grasping and clinging, and the not showing up with presence, is emotional reactivity. And this usually occurs when somehow the ego is threatened. Usually we're reactive because we feel a threat, we perceive a threat. Our agenda's being threatened, my expectations are being threatened, my wishes are being threatened, my wishes are not being met, I'm being disappointed. So when presence is absent, when the ego is threatened, when grasping and clinging is there, it's very likely I'm going to be reactive. And that can take many, many forms. It can take all the forms that Gottman talked about, the four horsemen that I mentioned a little while ago. Now, suffice it to say, we can never be completely free of reactivity. I mean, it's going to happen. It's going to show up for all of us. But with our practice, I think we can learn to reduce it, attenuate it, lessen it. And again, this has been another challenge in my own life and my own practice. The problem with reactivity is it creates distance. The result is we end up feeling separated, cut off, lonely. It's not conducive to closeness, intimacy, trust, caring, empathy, and so forth. We tend to become very defensive. We tend to become hypervigilant, looking for the next slight or the next upset or the next insult. And typically reactivity hides fear, it hides emotional pain. It's a way of shielding our lack of control that we feel in a relationship. It's in response to feeling misunderstood. It's in response to fearing that we're going to be embarrassed or humiliated, and the list goes on and on. I mean, all the ways that we perceive threat is usually what triggers reactivity. And needless to say, relationships are ripe for this kind of thing. Stephen Levine, the Buddhist teacher, said the reason your family pushes all your buttons is because they install them. But it is possible to become less reactive, to use our practice to build in that sacred pause, to build in that little separation between something gets triggered and then I say something, do something, express something in a reactive way, versus learning to catch that, kind of nip it in the bud whenever possible. So all of these four things represent real relationship challenges for us. We can frame them without the Dharma, but I think it's useful to look at them in this context because it really offers some tools for some antidotes for each of them in terms of improving the quality of our relationships with everyone, but most particularly our intimate relationships. And relationship challenges is sort of I've noted here, a good news, bad news situation. The bad news is that we tend to all act in pretty predictable ways when things don't go our way. It's just the way we're wired. And the causes and conditions result in our getting triggered by others. Rumi says, your path is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself you have built against it. Again, this is from Rumi. Your path is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself you have built against it. So the bad news is that we're, through causes and conditions, kind of wired to use these or engage in these four behaviors. The good news is that if we use our practice and the teachings of the Dharma, we can learn to be less predictable. We can learn to change the script. Someone said the world is divided into people who think they are right. Think about that. So, what exactly does the Dharma offer us in terms of these challenges that I've enumerated? Well, first of all, it presumes that we have a committed practice. I mean, it's not something we can just kind of breeze through and expect there to be any kind of significant improvement. It's hard work. I mean, I think relationship work is probably the hardest work any of us have to do. It's the most challenging. It asks the most of us. It's painful. It's scary. But the overarching practice in all of this, everything that we've talked about, is to bring mindful awareness moment to moment to our interactions with others. I mean, that's rule number one. That's the first order of business, is to bring mindful awareness moment to moment to our interactions with others. So there's our mindfulness. We need to show up mindfully to our relationships. We can't just go on autopilot and expect them to thrive and prosper. So, in terms of lack of presence, the antidote is to bring non-judging awareness of our own issues. And that includes lack of presence, grasping, clinging, reactivity. It's, in other words, accept what is without self-condemnation. So there has to be a component of self-compassion. There still has to be a component of compassion for the other person. But we have to be kind to ourselves in terms of all of our own issues, all of our own problematic behaviors. Because if we get into chastising ourselves about them, it's just not going to help us move beyond them. It's not going to be beneficial. So it's really using that practice, using our mindfulness to shine a light. You've probably heard me use this metaphor before, to shine a light into the dark corners of our personality, for all the disavowed parts, all the parts I don't want to acknowledge in myself. Shine that flashlight, and that's where we have to begin. But we have to be able to bring a quality of self-compassion, or we're just not going to want to go there. It's just too painful to look at that stuff without some compassion. Because I'm really talking here about brutal self-honesty. Dropping all those illusions about ourselves, dropping all the denial we have about our quirks and our problematic behaviors. It just has to be brutal self-honesty. And I honestly don't believe we can do that without some self-compassion. We need to notice the ego's compulsion to make reality different than it is. The Buddha talked a lot about seeing things clearly, seeing things as they really are. The reason we call it insight meditation is because it's a way of peeling away the veils of seeing things as they really are. And we need to be open to that tendency of the ego to make reality to fit our agenda, especially in relationships. To notice the ego's quality of the judging mind, both judging the other person in the relationship and judging ourselves. And then notice the ego's preoccupation with the past and the present, old grievances, future worries, rather than the present moment. What's going on right now with you and me as we interact, as opposed to, gosh, yesterday you forgot to do something. Tomorrow you may do it again. So non-judging awareness is the first of the antidotes. The second one is wise speech. And this is particularly applicable to the emotional reactivity. Joseph Goldstein says, make wise speech the cornerstone of your practice. Again, as I said a moment ago, it's pausing before we speak is a central element of wise speech. I don't think we can really implement wise speech without the pause. We have to be pretty advanced in our practice and probably pretty close to enlightenment to not have to put that pause in there. But it's the pause between the strong emotion that gets triggered and opening our mouth and speaking or expressing yourself non-verbally in a reactive way. So it's really a way of breaking up that sequence of reactivity. So when triggered, feeling reactive, try to catch it, try to wait to respond until the reactivity subsides a little bit. That's the challenge. That's our task in terms of wise speech as it relates to emotional reactivity. I can't say enough about the importance of that sacred pause and building that into our our relational interactions. The antidote for the absence of presence that I spoke about is presence. It's presence for the other to connect, to feel safe, to create a space, a holding environment, to create spaciousness in the relationship so that you're really showing up, I'm really showing up. We create a safe environment for our partner or the other person. And it really includes bringing our full attention, active listening, clarifying our intention when we bring presence. All of those things is a way of showing up and letting the other person know that we're really there. It's such a powerful gift to give someone, is to really show up with presence. Not be looking at the phone, not be thinking about the next thing we're going to say, not be looking at the TV out of a corner of my eye, whatever. Being fully there in terms of those interactions. And then the fourth one is to cultivate equanimity in the face of all the ego challenges, including the 8 worldly winds. We cling to or long for praise, we push away blame, we cling to gain, we seek to avoid loss, we long for fame, we seek to avoid disgrace, we cling to for pleasure and push away pain. The challenge is to be present with whatever comes up without clinging to it or pushing it away. And that's where the role of equanimity comes in. So it's, again, accepting things as they really are, not as we wish them to be, seeing them as they are, not as we wish them to be. And that's, again, especially true in relationships, I think. Mary Oliver says, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift." The fifth antidote is cultivating wisdom, out of which is born greater compassion and empathy. You might notice that all of these things are things we've talked about in other contexts, but I think they have particular relevance and application to our relationships. It's cultivating wisdom. Part of that's being able to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, acknowledge the other person's point of view, unhook from the ego's self-interest, the need to win the argument, to be right, to be superior, to always feel like we get our way, and share our vulnerability. We all struggle with vulnerability. We all try to hide it. We all run from it. But talking about it can be an incredible bridge to another person, sharing that vulnerability. And by doing so, I think it really invites the other person to reciprocate. Philip Moffat says, "Surrender your ego in relationships." I think that's really good advice. Surrender your ego in relationships. The sixth antidote is keeping our expectations low, acknowledge that we can't control the other person, letting go of the grasping and clinging of how we think they should be. But it's a conscious effort to lower our expectations in terms of not that we don't care, but that we're not going to hold people to standards that we impose on them that have more to do with my need for how you should be as opposed to who you might really be, in accepting that. So it really comes down to trying to be mindful moment to moment, day to day, of these 4 relationship categories, these 4 relationship issues that I talked about. Acknowledge the role that they play in our lives, shine that flashlight on them again, shine that flashlight on how they manifest in our individual life, and then bring these tools that we talked about to bear on them as a way of really deepening our connection with others. I mean, there's really nothing more satisfying than having a meaningful connection with another human being. As hard and difficult as it is, I think it's so well worth the effort. And the result is that it reduces my suffering, it reduces your suffering. Life's hard enough, and if we can really connect deeply, it's just such an antidote for so much of life's suffering. It's really one of the greatest gifts that the Dharma gives us and that we can give ourselves. So I want to close with a Mary Oliver poem. You may have heard me read this one before. It's one of my favorites, called The Journey. She says, one day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough in a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds. And there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world. Determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. So may we all hold our pain and sorrow with compassion. Let's sit for a few minutes. Okay. Well, thanks for your time and attention. Have a good week, and we'll see you next week.